Hey, welcome back. Sorry for the break in the flow. So I was just talking about this dot cards, which we can see here. So what we do is we store all of these images in our assets folder in an array. We pass it into this function of the game model, which creates an array of game card objects, which we discussed just a moment ago. They're past properties that store which picture they refer to. The index, which is just a unique ID that each game card needs when it's translated into a React component, which we'll get to in a minute, and state that just keeps track of which side of the card is showing at any given time. And these functions down here just kind of control, passing that information out to the rest of the program, and changing the state of like whether or not the card is flipped. The game model, again, so it's holding its cards, and it has a this.rerender function, which is really interesting. Again, we'll get to that in a little while. There's a little more to understand before we get there. So the game model, all these functions that we're seeing down here are the business logic of the game. We have a function that keeps track of how many cards are flipped and which ones are flipped. We have a function which will just flip all the cards in the deck down, which is what we saw in my demo when I had two cards flipped and they would stay, comic book cover side up for a minute and then flip down. And down here we have the most complex logic going on in the model, the flip function. And this, obviously, it takes in a card ID, which I referenced earlier, a property of the game card model, and it will flip the card. It will keep track of how many cards are flipped and perform all the necessary DOM manipulation accordingly. So that's kind of the logic that's going on behind the scenes of React and its DOM manipulation. So let's go back to the root component. These optional properties that I mentioned a while back are a very important part of React. React components have two crucial elements. They have elements called properties, or props for short, and they have something called state. So what are properties and state? Properties are sort of setting up the immutable conditions of the environment in which your program functions. Say, for instance, all of these images that I have that I'm working with. These images need to stick around. They can't be deleted. They can't be, their file in any way can't be altered. The only thing we change is whether or not they're showing. But since the image itself doesn't change, we store that in props. Again, the immutable properties. And another way to think about it is the environment that has to exist in order for your program to function. And the other crucial element of React components is something called state. So state is more like logic that we can manipulate in order to enact changes to the DOM. Say, for instance, the property of a game card, this dot flipped. Since that is a Boolean value, we can pass that into a card object as one property of its state, and don't get property of its state confused with props. but one data point of its state that can be called to manipulate the DOM and change the way that that card object looks. So state is defined, as you can see here with this getInitialState function, is defined inside of each component, but props, according to React's data flow, are passed from parent to child, which is why in the root component we are this line of code here for pictures and this line of code here for back image is how you declare some properties in a parent element, and it creates the necessary functionality to pass these properties down to the children of that component. So all pictures refers to an array which stores all of the strings of the file names of these pictures, and back image is a separate thing just for that JLA logo that you see right here that represents the back of the card. So these properties are passed down to the child of root component, which is the game board. Now let's take a look at this function here. It's called prop types. Prop types is a method that React provides to give you validations. It's really just for debugging purposes. It allows you to say that, hey, we're really going to need pictures for this program to happen. So you can say that it's required, and you can, for each property that's being passed to a component, you can specify what data type it should be. Here we have a string and an array. So you'll see here that we're using data from the model. Again, the game model file, we're using some business logic, and we're able to call it in React to create React's dynamic rendering of the DOM. So we call that .state. This is just a way to bind the proper this to this function here. We call the array of pictures that's being stored in the game model, and we map it to each card. And since map iterates for every element within an array, we'll create the exact amount of card elements that there are pictures that are being stored. Card components. And here in the card, you'll see that we're assigning some new properties here in the render function of the game board that will be passed down to each card child. So that's why we see each property, this property key, is being defined as card.id. So it's a card component is being rendered through the vanilla JavaScript object card that's in our model, and it takes as props each different variables from that card model structure. And just keep in mind, capital C card is for the React component, lower C card is for the model card object. So all of those things that we looked at, the image, the back image, the flipped state, and all of these things are being taken from data in the model. And that's data that we can manipulate. So another important thing to notice here on line 36 is this property called clickHandler. And it's passing as a property this function handleClick down to each child. Now, from my previous description, it might have seemed like you could only pass, like static data as properties, but you can also pass functions as properties from parent to child. So what we have here is a callback function that will allow us to change state and dynamically re-render game objects based on that change in state. So let's take a look at how that works. Down here in our card component, we see here it's the click handler is being validated, it's required, and it's a function. That's what func stands for there. We call it using this .props.clickHandler because any property, we saw a property declared for the child that was being rendered here in the game boards rendering of a card component, a pass click handler, and then if you want to use that property that's been passed, you use the syntax this .props. Whatever the name of that property is. So we're using click handler. Click handler references a callback to the function handle click. So there's some console logging for debugging purposes, and then we see this .state.model.flip. So if the card is face down, it changes the state to face up. And then it sets the state of our component and its corresponding, well, it changes the state in the model. I'm sorry. In line 19, what we do is we change the data in the model for the card. And the setState function is a way to dynamically change the React state property for a component. So we change it to reflect the state of the model. Now when we change the state, how does that affect what we see in the DOM? We use this function whichPick. WhicPick is being set as the source tag for our image element on the DOM. So this is a way to dynamically assign different values to something that's going to directly create a visual element on our web page. Let's take a look at how whichPick works. Use an if statement, and it basically looks at the state of flipped, whether it's flipped or not, and then returns this .props.front image, which is or this .props.back image. So the magic of React is that it's always listening for the any changes in state, and then through functions like this, which respond to state and render properties corresponding to what the state of a component is, we can that's what triggers the React's dynamic destruction and re-rendering of elements. So once again, if we go back here and look at our application, what's being happened when I click is that the state was changed. Again, a lot of things to keep track of here, right? First, we changed the state of the model, and then we set the state of the component to reflect that. And then our source tag information for the image element was dynamically altered to represent that change in state. And that's how we get all of this functionality here. So that's, I hope that was helpful and that it made sense. That's about as far as I've gotten with with my project. I would have very much liked to have been able to create, let's say, a time limit for how long the player has to find all the matches in the deck. I would have liked to have keep track of score, had a larger array of pictures to choose from, and dynamically render to the page. But I think that I've learned a whole lot, not only about React, the technology, but about the process of learning something new and teaching myself. And overall, I hope to use the lessons that I've learned from this to continue building upon this project and incorporating React into other projects in the future. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.